Welcome everybody to this RSA webinar on religiosity in Australia. My name, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Meredith Doig and I'm president of the Rationalist Society, which is Australia's oldest free thought group. Now, just a few housekeeping matters before we get going. If you do have questions for our guest speaker, could you put them in the chat box? Most people, I hope, know how to use the chat box, but there's a little icon at the bottom of your screen. So I'm now going to introduce our guest speaker, who is probably well known to at least some of you. Neil Francis is now a fellow of the Rationalist Society, but he's well known for his forensic research and evidence-based analysis. Over the years, he's led professional marketing and social research projects, but he's also been a very effective advocate for law reform to legalise voluntary assisted dying. As another RSA fellow, Paul Monk, writes in the latest issue of our journal, The Australian Rationalist, Neil's report on religiosity in Australia contains non-trivial findings. And indeed, there are more non-trivial findings to come, as Neil will no doubt tell you. He's now working on part 2 and part 3 of this research. That's all from me. I'm just going to hand over to Neil, who will speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have about 30 minutes for questions. Neil, over to you.
Thanks, Meredith, for that kind introduction. It's a delightful blend, if you will, of my long-term interest in religion and religiosity in Australia and how we hold those conversations at the national and the state levels, coming together with RSA's interests in ensuring that we have informed and well-educated debates about such matters. And so this presentation is based on part 1 of this series of reports. Part 1 is called Personal Faith According to the Numbers. So look, there will be a lot of numbers in this report, but I hope what I will do is present them in a way that makes sense. They're in charts, they're not in tables of figures. So I hope it's going to be suitably visual and reasonably easy to absorb. And so the subtitle of this address is The Religious Devouts and Their, I've added, Disproportionate Political Clout. And I hope it will become quite evident by the end of my presentation as to why I've added disproportionate there. Because it is really important that we balance and inform the national conversation about such matters, because at the moment there is a great lack of balance in discussing religion and how that impacts legislation, government investment, and so forth. But just before I launch into some of the findings of the study, I just want to make it quite clear, something that's really important, that these matters that are in this report are not on the basis of hearsay or wild claims or because it's said so often. They're actually on the basis of gold standard sources. And so what I've employed and brought together and synthesized in this report, part 1, is data from scholarly studies that are in the peer-reviewed literature. I have mined university data sets of the highest caliber. It includes information from government reports and also from professional surveys. So not the little things that newspapers run for interest's sake. These are surveys that are run by professional social and market researchers. So I'm going to talk to 3 main themes this evening, because you'll be delighted to know I'm not going to talk to all 152 pages of the report. And I'm not going to talk to all 108 figures in the report. We're being pretty selective. So I will hone this down to 3 major propositions, and they're these. First of all, we're going to discuss how religious we really are. We have data from the census. I think everybody knows the headline statistics from the census, or most of us do. That doesn't really give us a good picture. So how religious are we really? The second proposition I'd like to cover is, how does religion affect or not affect voting at federal elections? Because this is really misunderstood by politicians on both sides of the aisle. And the third proposition we're going to explore is, what are the real views of religious Australians? Because clerics tell us that they're one thing. Are they on the money? Are they wrong? We're going to explore that and see what the data actually says religious people believe. And so let's move on to the first part of the report. How religious are we? So kind of the sub-theme of this is, will the real religion stand up? Because there are multiple ways of measuring religion. And the way you measure it has quite an effect on the resulting statistics you get. And so here are some of the ways of measuring religion. The first and the easiest is affiliation. You ask people, what is your religion? And they tick a box. It's either not a religion or it's one of the religious denominations. And that, I have to say, is about the least meaningful way of measuring religion, because it doesn't mean terribly much. We can also measure it by behaviour. So religious behaviour like religious service attendance, praying, reading religious texts and so forth. These are all specific exhibits of behaviour about religion. These can tell us important things about our relationship with religion. Another way of measuring it is identity, and that is a sense of belonging to one's religious community. Another is salience, that is, how important is religion to us in our personal lives. That's an important measure. And of course, one that would be obvious to most people is measuring religious beliefs. So do we believe in God, the afterlife, heaven, hell, and a range of religious tenets. And all of these different ways tell us important things about the relationship we have with religion, not just ticking a box. And so let's have a look at the first one. Many of us have seen ABS census statistics. The census has been run periodically since Federation in 1901. And the data is pretty clear. If you look at the green section up here, we've got all the denominations. Catholics are red, Anglicans are purple here in this diagram. But up the top here, the green section is people of no religion. And we can see that that is increasing quite substantially over recent years, particularly since 1971. 1971 is a particularly important year for this question, because it is the first time Australians were told answering the question was optional, and they were told they could say no religion. That is really quite astounding. It was the first year Australians were allowed, expressly told they were allowed to answer no religion. But it's decreasing. And so we're seeing quite a decrease in Anglicanism, a decrease in minor Christian denominations. Catholicism has started to decline as well. So we're seeing quite a significant trend here over a number of decades. So the important thing to say about this is affiliation. This is a binary question that asks you kind of, do you belong to a religion or not? And that doesn't give you a lot of information. Binary tells you two things, yes or no. Okay, so it tells us which denomination it might be. But one of the things I did in analysing the data sets that were available to study these relationships, I had access to a number of data sets from Australian National University. So they included the Australian Election Study, the Australian Values Study, the Australian Study of Social Attitudes, and so forth. So there was a range of very, very high quality data sets. And I looked at all of those and found a common denominator that I could calculate and create a new segmentation. But it's still a fairly straightforward, but a much more insightful segmentation. And so instead of just having kind of yes, no, where the yes is a collection of denominations, We now have an ARI6, that's the Australian Religious Identity 6-segment model, and it combines affiliation with behaviour. And it goes from the least religious, who are rejectors, through socialisers, nationals, occasionals, regulars, and Australia's most devout, obviously called devouts. And you can see the relative proportions of the sizes of those segments. Now, the first two segments are the guys and gals who tick no religion. So we've taken that one answer and we've already split it into two. And the other four are the people who tick denominations. So we've now got 4 sub-segments of people who ticked a denomination. So we're able to say far more about people's relationship with religion by looking at this. What is the behaviour that I used? The behaviour is attending religious services. And so if we look at the range of behaviour of religious services, so here we have the denominations, Catholic, Anglican, Uniting Church, other minor Christian denominations and non-Christian denominations. Notionals are the folks who never, ever turn up to religious services. That's why I've called them notionals. So they tick the box to say I'm Anglican, but they never turn up to religious services. And overall, that's almost 4 in 10 Australians. It's an astonishing figure. It's almost 4 in 10 Catholics. It's over 4 in 10 Anglicans and Uniting Church. A quarter of minor Christian denominations and well over 4 in 10 of those of non-Christian religions. Well, let's move on to the next one. The light purple are occasionals. These are folks who turn up to religious services less than once a year or up to several times a year. So, you know, your Easter and Christmas visitors. And look at the size of those. So these are people who have a relationship, but a casual, intermittent relationship with religion. They're occasionals. Now, regulars and devouts are the folks. Regulars turn up at least once a month. Devouts turn up weekly or more often. And together, later on, we're going to call those committeds. So you can see amongst the religions, so here for Catholicism, here for Anglicanism, you're seeing the proportion of people who have ticked that denomination box who are committed to that religion. And it's a pretty smaller number than the headline figure you get from the census. So there's our second way of measuring. Let's have a look at identity. So one of the surveys, it was the Australian Values Survey in 2018, asked respondents, do you belong? To what degree do you belong to your religious organisation? And they also asked, are you active in your religious organisation? And those who are inactive are light red, and those who don't belong at all, they report, no, I really don't belong to my religious organisation. You can see the size here. So notionals, these are our religious folks, notionals through devouts. We can see seas of red here, so that there's an extraordinary softness of identity with religious affiliation that's quite evident from this information. And if we go back to the 2016 data and make some adjustments, they look like this. So I've got 3 donuts here, and the one on the left, these are so Catholics, Anglicans, minor Christian denominations, other religions. These are the proportions. These are the nuns, by the way, the greens are nuns. These are the proportions that were ticked in the census. But when we adjust the census data by people who answered, yes, I think I belong to my religious organisation, they shrink to this. And when you adjust them to just those who say, I not only belong, but I'm active in my religious organisation, it shrinks to this. And I think you'll agree that both belonging and active are significantly different from the figure, the headline figure you get from the census alone. That's quite a different relationship. This is the kind of conversation we should be having at the national level. So let's just quickly move on to the next one, salience. So people were asked, how important is religion to you in your personal life? So this is how relevant, how meaningful religion is in daily life to all the respondents. And you'll see here the division between very important and rather important. All the other folks said not really important or not important at all. So these are the folks who are saying, yeah, this is salient, this is relevant to my life. And so just over a quarter, less than a third of Australians are saying religion is important in my life. About half of Catholics are saying it's important. So let's just pause on that for a moment, folks. Half of Catholics, that's this bit here that's missing, don't say religion is important in their lives. Even more Anglicans say religion is not important in their lives, and so forth. So we get quite a different perspective on Australians' relationship with religion when we look at the salience. Let's have a quick look at beliefs. So here are questions. I've narrowed this down to certainty, and I've done this for a particular reason. When a cleric is on national television and says, God says abortion is wrong, I want to point out to you here, so this is total, all Australians, this is about 20%, 1 in 5 Australians actually is confident that a God of some kind exists. Not only the God you said something, but a God, any God, whether they agreed with what you attributed to the God, only 1 in 5 Australians is confident that a God exists. And you can see here are our religious people, notionals, about 20% of notionals, 1 in 5 notionals is confident God exists. And heaven and hell and religious miracles and life after death. About 30% of occasionals, these are people who turn up once in a while to religious services. And only amongst regulars and devouts, remember this is just 15% of the population, only amongst regulars and devouts are those opinions in the majority. But even amongst devouts, I can point out, so if we take an average there, let's say it's 85%, 15% of devouts are not convinced there's a God or a heaven or a hell or religious miracles or life after death. They're pretty amazing statistics. And one other view on beliefs, this is a very clear trend that's been occurring over many decades. In 1990, roughly 20% of Australians did not believe in either a specific God or a generic higher power, some kind of supernatural power. And now in 2020, it's double. It's about 40%. So it's increasing quite rapidly. Now, these are all important aspects of understanding religion and interpreting what we mean when we talk about religion in the public square. So in the national conversation about religiosity, we can note several things. First of all, there's a long-term decline in affiliation since 1970. And real religion is much lower by practical measures. So not this notional tick the box. Someone might tick a box saying Anglican because your family is historically Anglican, but you don't go to services, you don't necessarily believe in those tenets, you're not really Anglican. But when you measure by practical measures, behaviour, identity, salience, belief, you actually get some real perspectives of Australians' relationship with religiosity. Okay. So I'm going to move on to part 2, and that's about how does religion affect voting in federal elections? And I raise this matter particularly because we're going to have a federal election coming up in 6 or 8 months. We're not quite sure when it's going to be yet, but there is one coming up. And Labor's analysis of his surprise loss at the last federal election, it was run by Craig Emerson and Jay Weatherill. They did a huge amount of consultation and investigation. And one of the things they said in their report was that, on the whole, people of faith did not desert Labor, but Labor lost some support among Christian voters. And this has been interpreted by certain segments on both sides of the aisle, I have to say, not just on the Labor side, that the religious vote is, it's very real and it's quite significant. And I'm going to share with you 5 very specific reasons why I think that is seriously overstated and in fact quite misguided. So the first one is, what's the relationship between non-religionist and religionist Australians' views about who's the best economic manager? And here we have the data from the Australian Election Study 2019. So this was actually run immediately after the 2019 election. And this data is pretty darn clear. If you have a look at the religious folks, you will see that they are all significantly higher in believing that the coalition is better at economic management. So there's reason one. The next reason is a very clever political campaign that the coalition ran during the 2019 election, and it looked like this. The bill Australia can't afford. And that was a very clever slipstream. In marketing, we like to use slipstreams to join a proposition to a well-known statement. And so the well-known statement is the bill you can't afford. And here we have the bill Australia can't afford, which alleges higher taxes, which was actually kind of partly true. The Labor Party was intending to raise taxes on a couple of things, which we'll talk about one of them, alleging greater debt and a weaker economy. Now tie this in with the previous chart, which shows that religionists are far more likely to think the coalition better at economic management, but link this also to low income. If we look at low income households, who are the people who are most affected by bills, can you even pay your electricity bill, for example, you'll find that those in the lowest brackets are significantly higher. There's a much greater rate of low-income households amongst the religious than there are amongst rejectors. So that's another reason. The next reason is one which is a little surprising. Labor says it is the party of the workers. At the 2019 election, it did not make a big issue about jobs. The coalition did. And in fact, they carried on that theme from, if anyone remembers, at the 2016 election, which was Malcolm Turnbull, number of times, I think we lost count of how many thousand times he said jobs and growth. That was the slogan, to the extent that it was actually turned into a bloke's name, Jobs and Growth. So Mr. Jobs and Growth is fairly important. And here we have, amongst the regulars and the devouts, a significantly very elevated level of unemployment. And so you'll find that that will also impact the religious vote, but not because of religion, because of job security. And here is the part that's linked with that. And that is in terms of, one of the questions that was asked was, if you were to lose your job, how easy or hard do you think it would be to get another job? And you find that amongst the religious, so again, notionals, occasionals, regulars and devouts, those who think it will be very difficult to get a new job is significantly higher than the rejectors, the people who mark no religion. So there we have another reason, and I'll share one more with you. These are not all of them. These are just some. At the 2019 election, one of the policies of Labor was that it would remove the cash dividend rebate of people who got dividends from listed company shares, and if their income was below the taxable threshold, they would actually receive a rebate on those dividends, which is a policy I personally disagree with, but nevertheless, here we have the occasionals, the regulars and the devouts, and we can see that their ownership, this is the ownership, share ownership, the proportion of people in these groups who own listed company shares. And you can see that occasionals, regulars and devouts own company shares at a vastly higher rate than the others. And so here we have a confluence of reasons, if you will, 5 solid financial reasons, not religious reasons, but financial reasons that make the 2019 federal election vote look religious, because the religious are more economically conservative, because religious households have lower income, because regulars and devouts have high unemployment rates, because the religious are more likely to believe it's very hard to get another job, and because the most religious have much higher company share ownership, which was an issue in that election. And so here we have a national conversation to be had with both sides of the political spectrum, if you will, that the notion that the religious vote is really important and it's religious is a bit of a misnomer. I have to say, I'm not saying there's no such thing as a religious vote. Of course, in some circumstances where there's a religious issue to arise at an election, you may well find religious voting. This is to say that in the ordinary course of events, what you think is a religious vote is actually financial and job security. And if there's any doubt about the appetite of Australians for a more conservative, more Christian party, can I just remind everyone of the demise of the Australian Conservatives? It was founded was actually registered by Cory Bernardi in 2017, and it was deregistered 2 years later in 2019 because there was insufficient appetite for this kind of representation, political representation. And in fact, two members lost their seats under this party. So that's the second part. Let's move on to the third part, and that is, what are Australians' religious views? And I'm going to confine my remarks, if I may, to just 3 items. So they're going to be abortion, voluntary assisted dying, and marriage equality. So first of all, let's have a look at abortion. And here is the Catholic Archbishop of Brisbane, Mark Coleridge, who obviously, by being a Catholic Archbishop, is quite opposed to abortion, said he was heartened by signatures to a campaign against abortion, but he made the assertion, quite literally, that abortion are not the core values and beliefs of society. Well, Archbishop, let's inform ourselves. This is what Australian people actually think about abortion. The green folks across the religious denominations think that abortion should be readily available. The yellow folks think that, yes, it should be available, but in specific circumstances. And only the red folks say abortion should never be available. And you can see here that amongst Catholics, more than 60% of Catholics, these are real people, think that abortion should be freely available. Mr. Coleridge is not representing his own flock. Same amongst the Anglicans. Great majorities of people saying that it should be available either freely or at least in special circumstances. What does that look like for religiosity? So here are here's the religiosity scale. And you find, apart from a tiny little blip here, all of the nevers appear under devout, but almost 80% of devouts. These are the most religious people in the nation, folks. Almost 80% of the devouts say abortion should be available. So when archbishops say it's not a community value, I don't think the archbishops are listening to anybody except the red lot down here. All right, let's move on to voluntary assisted dying, or VAD for short. Here is Tim Harris. He is the Bishop of Townsville. Tim Harris is the spokesperson for the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference on Voluntary Assisted Dying. So when there is something to be said about VAD, he's the man. Last year, he wrote to all Queensland MPs on behalf of his 80,000 Townsville Catholic flock to oppose VAD law reform, to urge members to vote against law reform, saying it's the right thing to do. I'm representing Catholics in the seat of Townsville. Well, we have the benefit of Vox Pop data. If you don't know Vox Pop, they're the people who run Vote Compass. Maybe you've heard of that, run through the ABC. People can log on online, answer a range of questions and find out where they're positioned relative to parties heading into an election. From that incredible sample size, which was more than 550,000 Australians, we were able to determine what the actual opinions of actual Catholics in his actual diocese were. And here they are. The Green folks support VAD. These are not any voters, folks. These are Catholics in the Diocese of Townsville. It begs the question, we can only ask, who is the bishop talking to? Clearly, it's not most of his own flock, because 8 in 10 of his own flock agree, and only about 1 in 10 disagree with VAD. Okay, and by denomination, nationally, so this is nationally now, you can see there are only small pockets of opposition to VAD. And across all of the denominations, except amongst the minor Christian denominations, they are well in the majority in favour of VAD law reform. By religiosity, well, there's no surprise. The opposition to VAD is highest amongst devouts, but this is worth pointing out. Amongst the devouts, almost as many are in favour of VAD as are opposed to it. So when a devout person says it's wrong, we must not allow it, they're not representing even a significant proportion of Australia's most religious. Very quickly, move on to the last one, which is marriage equality. And here is Glenn Davies, former Anglican Archbishop of Sydney, who made a $1 million donation to the No campaign for the legalisation, sorry, I forgot what. The
plebiscite.
Plebiscite, thank you. The plebiscite we ran at a cost of hundreds of millions of dollars as to whether the Parliament would deal with legislation for marriage equality. He donated from the church funds $1 million to the No campaign, saying that it was because of social justice issues, not at the expense of social justice issues, which drew some pretty sharp criticisms. Now, not every cleric is of this calibre. You'll find that some are on quite the other side of the fence. Here's Anglican Father Rod Bauer from Gosford, who has quite a different view, obviously. So what do Australians really think? So again, denominations, Catholic, Anglican, blah, blah. And we see that except amongst the minor Christian denominations, those who oppose marriage equality are in the minority. And by religiosity, all except devouts, they're in the minority. So almost across the board, but even amongst devouts, that is a third of devouts who say that marriage equality, so the question for this one was, should same-sex couples have equal rights? So a generic question in terms of rights. A third of Australia's most religious said, yes, they should have equal rights. And so let me conclude this little section by pointing out that here's Australians' attitudes towards whether clerics are the ultimate interpreters of law in Australia. And you'll see a sea of red there. These are the people who say, well, no. And there are very small minorities of people, even amongst devouts, very small minorities who think that clerics in one fashion or another ought to be the final arbiters of law. So that's pretty much a resounding no. So in summary of this section, we can say that only tiny minorities oppose abortion right across the religious spectrum. Only small or tiny minorities oppose VAD across the religious spectrum. And minorities oppose marriage equality across the spectrum, except for the minor Christian denominations and for devouts. And yet even a third of devouts support marriage equality. So there is a great diversity of views, and saying that all Christians should support or oppose something is obviously not representing those views. And so in conclusion, let's revisit our 3 items. We found that religion is in significant decline. And when you measure it by practical measures, not a notional measure, but with practical measures, it's actually substantially lower than the headline census statistic says. In terms of a notional religious vote in federal elections, there are clear multiple financial factors that drive one to misinterpret that these votes are Christian when they're not. And in terms of socially progressive issues, we covered 3. They're not the only ones, but certainly at least amongst those 3. Clerics misrepresent, when they oppose these social reforms, they misrepresent even the devout amongst their denominations, because there is such a range of views. So I thank you for listening to me for quite a bit, and I would be very happy to take questions. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, Neil. And I'm going to open up to questions. We have some questions in the chat box, and I'm going to go through. I'm going to ask our Treasurer, Brendan Liveritz, to go through those questions in a sec. But just before I do, there were 2 questions that were sent in ahead of time. So I'm going to go through those questions first, and then we'll go to the questions in the chat box. So firstly, you mentioned the census question on religion is biased. How much effect does a biased question in the census question? So if we know that there's a census coming up, we know that there is a question on religion in the census, and you've mentioned that the question on religion in the census is so framed that it produces some biased results. Could you just talk a little bit about how does it distort the measurement of religion?
Yes, certainly. Having worked in social research for many, many years and read literally thousands of peer-reviewed research papers, some of which are actually about specifically about biased questions and the order in which you ask them, because they all affect the answers we get. It's quite evident from these studies that a small amount of bias would be a 5% sway on the result. A moderate amount would be 10, 15 is not unrealistic, even 20%. When you word a question in a way that is presumptive of one thing or another, then you get these kind of effects. But let me just share my screen again, because I can answer that one quite exactly in this context. And so here we have, in Australia, so the green ones are Australia. These results are from 2016. There's the census, came up with that figure. The Australian election study from ANU came up with that figure. And in 2019, the Australian election study with the same question came up with this figure. So in 20...
we can't see the screen.
I beg your pardon. Oh, you can't see. Oh, I beg your pardon. Sorry. Is that better?
Mm-hmm. That's it.
Sorry. Let me start again. So in Australia is in green. And here's the census 2016. Here's the Australian election study 2016. Here's the same study in 2019. You can see that the no religion cohort has grown substantially. This is in 2018, so just a bit before this. You'd expect the answer to be about there. But this one was actually asked with a balanced question. So all of these studies, the census and the AES, ask the question, what is your religion? And ask you to tick a box. That's a presumptive question. It presumes you've got a religion to tick a box, even if you put no religion at the top. So if you ask, what's your religion? And the first answer is no religion, you've got a pretty incoherent question. But the question itself is biased. And what it ought to ask is, at the very least, what is your religion, comma, if any? And with that, then you balance the question out. And so you can see that there is a gap here. Let's say that is about 15% from the expected. So the biased question is actually downloading, it's uploading religion or downloading no religion, if you will, if you follow, just by that bias. Here in the UK, so the blue one, that's the Office of National Statistics, that's their equivalent of the ABS, and the British Survey of Social Attitudes. This is the same year, folks. This is the biased question, what's your religion? This is a balanced question, and you can see again, there's, what's that, 13, maybe 14% difference in people ticking the no religion box.
So between a
balanced question
percent difference in the way that the question is worded.
Yes, so same respondents, same everything else, same sampling, just the wording of the question here is making a 12 or 14% difference in the results.
Thanks, Neil. Brendan, I'm going to come to you. You've been watching the questions in the chat box. Would you like to read one of those out, please?
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, Neil. I think that was an excellent presentation and summary of a very big report. So it's good to have the summarised view. A couple of questions from Brodie Lane that come up. Where can I find religious discrimination? Sorry, where can I find what religious discrimination is still legal across the country against LGBTQIA+ people?
Well, that's a complex question because there is both national and state legislation. I have to say I'm not an expert at that entire collection. I wonder, Meredith, is that something Luke might speak to?
Yeah, I'm just seeing whether Luke is still with us. No.
And I see we have the lovely Jamie Gardner with us, and I wonder if Jamie might have an answer he'd care to share.
Jamie, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Just give me that question again as they asked it.
Yeah, no problem. Where can I find what religious discrimination is still legal across the country against LGBTQIA+ people?
The short answer to that is simply everywhere except Tasmania, it is still legal. The longer answer and more difficult answer is in the relevant anti-discrimination acts or equal opportunity acts of all the states and territories, and only in Tasmania, and maybe it's Tasmania and the ACT, is there any limitation on the power of religious bodies to discriminate at will? So, blanket. There may be a few slight tweaks to that, but that's the answer.
So, Brodie, if you were putting together a report, one of the places that you should call is Equality Australia, and they're likely to have the information that you need. That'd be the quickest way of getting everything that you need.
Yeah, that's quicker and equally authoritative, and they've done the work on looking up all the legislation. So
Okay.
yeah, thanks, Meredith.
Thanks, Brodie. Okay. Brendan, have you got another question?
Yeah, there was one more from Brody, probably sits with you, Meredith. What is the current status of the new Religious Freedom Bill the Morrison government has mooted? It seems to have gone off the radar since COVID.
Okay. We've got Luke Beck with us, who is a specialist in religious law around Australia. Luke, would you like to make a comment about that?
Sorry, could you just repeat the question very quickly?
Yeah, no problem. What is the current status of the new, of the new Religious Freedom Bill the Morrison government has mooted? That's from Brody.
Yeah, so far we've had exposure drafts of religious freedom or religious discrimination bills, and then it went quiet, and both versions copped a lot of criticism from all sorts of angles, both from non-religious groups, human rights organisations, but also from the ultra-conservative religious groups who wanted an even bigger right to inflict discrimination against people they don't like. So then it went quiet for quite a while due to COVID. About a month, 6 weeks ago, the new Attorney General, Michaelia Cash, mentioned that work is currently underway on a third exposure draft, and that she's been having meetings with interested parties, but we don't know when that third draft is going to be released. We don't know what her thinking is about what should be in it, in terms of should it just be a stock standard protect people against discrimination bill, a shield would be fine, or should it include all the kinds of additional nasty provisions that were in the Christian Porter drafts that gave religious groups and religious people essentially a license or a special right to ignore other laws and to discriminate and inflict harms on other people. So we don't know really what the status of that is, except that it's sort of bubbling away in the background, and that selected groups have had meetings with the Attorney General and the government, but that other groups, interested parties, such as the Rational Society, have not had the privilege of having consultation with the Attorney General on this supposed third version of the bill. So something's happening, but it's all very secretive and hush-hush. So the public doesn't really know. So the government, like God, perhaps works in mysterious ways.
The RSA has written to Michaelia Cash, the new Attorney General, to ask if we could get a meeting with her. That was a couple of weeks ago, and we haven't heard anything back. Surprise, surprise. But we'll persevere. I just wanted to summarise the import of what Neil has presented to you in the light of this so-called Religious Freedom Bill. It's interesting that everybody's calling it a Religious Freedom Bill. The actual title is supposed to be Religious Discrimination Bill. But of course, everybody is calling it the Religious Freedom Bill because we know that behind the scenes, people like the group called Freedom for Faith have had privileged access behind the scenes to people like Michaelia Cash. And they are pushing for the draft bill, the third version of the bill, to be even stronger, to privilege institutionalized religion even more than the previous two versions. So watch out. This is going to be a huge shit fight. Excuse the French. Luke, while we've got you here, could I just ask another question that was sent in from Denny Lawrence in Western Australia? And it's about the Religious Discrimination Bill as it might affect voluntary assisted dying. And she asks, if the Religious Discrimination Bill passes, how could that affect the state-based voluntary assisted dying laws, because the Religious Discrimination Bill would be a federal law in various states. So in Western Australia, the St John of God Hospital in Western Australia has bylaws that prohibit employees and their medicos from providing healthcare in a manner that they say demonstrates a lack of commitment to the ethics of the Catholic Church. Is that contrary to equal opportunity law? And B, could people, say nurse practitioners who want to assist in voluntary assisted dying, but outside of the actual hospital, but if they're actually employed by the hospital, could their jobs be at risk?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question, but also an extremely complicated and technical question. And it will come down to a very close analysis of what the state-based VAD laws say and what the federal religious freedom law says if that eventuates. The basic proposition is that federal law overrides any inconsistent state law, but that comes down to the question of, is there any inconsistency? Under the second draft religious freedom bill, that draft legislation proposed to give organisations the right to bring actions or sue for discrimination, whereas ordinarily discrimination is something experienced by human beings, individuals, and only individuals can bring complaints on the grounds of race discrimination, sex discrimination, etc. But the religious discrimination bill will allow groups to impose and organisations to bring those claims. So, depending on what the legislation said, it might be the case that a religious hospital could say that the state-based laws are somehow discriminatory against them, but it will all come down to
Luke, your audio is going in and out.
They are quite wide for religious individuals and religious organisations and groups to promote those, what they like to refer to as, facilitating their ethos.
Okay, Luke, I'm going to stop because your audio is fading in and out. Just to summarise, the answer to Dinny to the question is that it's complicated. The general principle is that a federal law can override state law, but it depends on how the federal law, that is the Religious Discrimination Bill, how that the third version and what's in it, how they write it. So we don't know at this stage, but there is a real risk that the Religious Discrimination Bill will be written so as to override the clear intent of the majority of voters in the various states, that they want voluntary assisted dying to go ahead. As you can see in Neil's data, the vast majority of people in Australia, even the religious people, want voluntary assisted dying.
Can I
sorry.
just add one quick thing in a sort of part answer to that question, if I can perhaps put out a little bit of a spoiler alert for part 2, and that is keep an eye out. This is terribly important because obviously the Catholic Church, being a major provider of healthcare, aged care and education services, says that its institutional conscience ought to prevail. Spoiler alert, I will be clearly arguing that there is no such thing as institutional conscience in part 2. Keep an eye out for it.
And Neil, how are you going on that?
Oh, Meredith, I was hoping you wouldn't ask. No, it's going well. It's going well. I'm a few days off the last bits.
Okay. I should assure everybody that we have sent Neil's report to every federal MP and every senator, and indeed at great expense we've actually printed it in, whoops, can't see that very well, in hard copy, and we've sent that to selected MPs and senators like Amanda Stoker, Michaelia Cash, Mark Dreyfus, and so on. So, and with a covering note pointing out that for the Labor Party people, that their assumption that there was a backlash from the religious vote at the last federal election actually is not so. It's more to do with economic matters, and pointing out to the coalition people that the number of people who are devouts, who are strongly attached to their religion and active in their religion are a very small number of voters in Australia, and that they will be, they should really pay attention to the vast majority of Australians, the mainstream religionists, who do not agree with the more conservative religious clerics. That is an incorrect assumption, obviously pushed by those conservative religious clerics and people like the Australian Christian Lobby, but they do not represent the vast majority of the notionals and the occasionals. Is that correct, Neil?
Correct.
Yeah. So the coalition people, the moderates within the coalition, hopefully will be able to decipher some of Neil's pretty pictures. We did point out these sorts of conclusions that they should pay particular attention to in the covering note that we sent with our report. Brendan, are there other questions that you'd like to bring up from the chat box?
Yeah, look, there's we don't have many in total anyway, so there's a few that we can probably answer relatively quickly. Michael Ananyo, sorry if I pronounced that wrong, how do they, I think it was the devouts and the more religious, have higher share ownership as well as lower incomes and higher unemployment rates? Neil, I guess this just comes down to that number is not representative of total value, but just ownership itself. Would that be a fair view on that?
Yeah, look, I considered that when I was looking at the data. One of the things that it's important to remember that when we look at statistics, they're statistics. So when we say there is an elevated proportion of the committed, so the regulars and the devouts and the occasionals who own shares in listed companies, that's not to say that they all do. So one has to take a balance between not over-assuming that the description applies to everybody in the segment. It just means that they're more likely in that segment. So indeed, there may be those in the segment who are on lower income, and in fact, a lot more of those, particularly in the devout segment, are people who are looking after others. So in fact, they're not even in the workforce. So in that sense, they wouldn't be terribly troubled about the difficulty of getting another job. They wouldn't be affected by that particular dimension. But they would be affected by the dimension of perceiving higher taxes, and so the bill you can't afford because their income is low and they're looking after other people.
I think that's yeah. I think we probably wouldn't be able to see the detail and the statistics behind that, but it was something that stood out to me as well. I think it's a good question. Linda Peach asked, "What's the gender breakdown?" And this was on the slide. I think was commenting on abortion. At that point, but I guess the root of the question is, did you have gender data that split some of those categories as well?
I don't have, I can easily generate it, but I don't have data at my fingertips in relation to individual issues. One could surmise that females would be significantly more in favour of the availability of abortion services than males. I think I did see that at one stage. I don't have the actual charts. There is one thing that I think is worth pointing out in relation to gender, if I can just quickly spot it. Yes, here we are. So I'm just going to share this if I can. I'll see if I'll do it properly this time. Share screen. This is something that's pretty important because there is, we're all aware of the much higher religiosity in the USA. And the question is that kind of thing beginning to become more common here? And the answer actually is, well, yeah, kind of, because here we have the gender trends in religiosity. So here you've got the percent of males in each category. And you will see that up the top end of the spectrum here, amongst the regulars and devouts, whereas in 2007, there was a predominance of females, there is now a predominance of males. So in fact, this trend amongst the more religious, so this is the top 15% of religion in Australia, is moving quite muscularly, if I can put it that way, towards the right, towards religiosity.
There's a sort of a loosely similar question that says what's the age of the devout who had the economic concerns and voted Conservative? Did you have a take on that as well?
Look, there is an age profile in the report. I don't have that one exactly with me, but I do want to make one point which is pretty important, and that is it's quite okay to use the expression religious conservatives. We know what we mean when we say we combine religion with conservatism. We have to be careful when we're using that expression with politics, because I don't think I have the chart here. Oh, yes, I do. Yes, I do. Let me just move forward to when we're talking about politics. So it's quite common, for example, in a common discussion to say the religious right. That's quite different from saying religious conservatives, because right means political, and they are not always overlapping. Let me show the Australian data just very quickly. Share that screen, that one, share. Here is the profile of political left-right. And now these are for committeds. I think I've gone one slide too far. Let me go back. Come on. Why are you not talking to me? There we are. Okay, so these are the not committeds. So this is all the groups from very unreligious to somewhat religious. This is most of Australia. This is 85%. And you'll see kind of the bell curve, the distribution between left and right is, you know, it's kind of balanced. Not much to see there. It's kind of what you would expect. And so that's for 85% of the population. When we talk about Australia's most religious, the committeds, the picture is quite different. So not only is there a lean to the right, but in recent years, the lean to the hard right has significantly increased. Now, having said that, I want to point out there are still people on the left and the hard left. So when we're having these conversations, it's quite important to be clear about the difference between a religious conservative and a religious right, because some religious conservatives are actually left. I know that's confusing, but we need to be clear whether we're talking about religion or politics.
No, that's good. Thanks, Neil. There was a comment. Now I can't remember who it came from because I didn't cut and paste that part. But the use of the word.
This will have to be the last one because we did promise that it'd be just 1 hour. So.
Yeah, great. Okay, no worries. So the use of the word currently, they pointed out if we included the word currently when we're talking, when we're asking someone about their religion, would that influence the outcome of it? And with particular reference to, we're not asking the question about were you religious 50 years ago, but what are you now? Do you think that would be a factor in the census and would influence the outcome?
Oh, well, what a wonderful question. The thing that you want to do with the census is to find out what things are now, not what they were 20 years ago, but certainly what they are now. And in running a survey, you're limited by the number of questions you can ask. You can certainly ask about prior experience or belief or belonging or whatever. But the important thing is that the census informs government policy, it informs legislation, it informs funding and so forth. So the government does quite rightly want to know about them now. But the other part of the question is, what a wonderful introduction to part 2. Keep an eye out for part 2, because in part 2, we have access to some of the most wonderful detailed data, not only about Australians' current religiosity, but about their religiosity when they were growing up. when you compare Australians' religiosity when they were growing up with their religiosity now, you will see that they're absolutely chalk and cheese. So some important messages are going to come out of that as well.
Great, excellent. Thanks, Neil.
Okay, thanks everybody. I think we do have to wrap it up because we did promise that it would be just 1 hour. A couple of questions that have come in on the chat box. Where can you get a copy of the report? I've put a link to the report, which is on the RSA website, and we've helpfully divided it into a number of chapters. So you can look at the executive summary or the part on religious trends, or the part on economics and politics, or the part on social issues. And then somebody also asked whether or not there would be a recording of this presentation. The answer is yes, and we'll put that up on our YouTube and send you a link to it in a day or so. On your behalf, I'm going to thank Neil very, very much for his presentation. It's so hard when there is so much detail in this presentation. What we're hoping is that this report will provide a reference point for many years to come. And that reference point should really have the overarching message that people like us who are in favour of a genuinely secular Australia, that is one where we accept that religion is part of people's free choice, but that free choice should not have free privilege to impose one's religion on everybody else. So that if you are going to have religious freedom, then you must also have the freedom from religion. So freedom of religion, if and only if there is freedom from religion. And make no mistake, there are forces in Australia who are pushing the federal government to increase the amount of religious privilege, not just for individuals, but for religious institutions. And it must be resisted. So please, when we write to you and ask you to write to your federal MPs, please do that. The only way that we are going to have a fair and free and secular country is if we all take some time and some effort to write to our MPs and insist that this is what we want. We do not want to have a soft theocracy in this country. For now, I'm going to say good night to everybody. Thank you very much for attending.